I was looking through the source stack for today, and this one image just kept jumping out at me.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
Okay, so picture this. It's 1773. You have the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great. I mean, arguably the most powerful woman on the planet at that point.
Right.
And she's sitting in her private chambers. And across from her, like knee to knee, is this 60-year-old French philosopher.
And he's not just sitting there quietly, is he?
No, that's the thing. He's practically climbing on top of her. He's shouting, he's waving his arms around, and every single time he makes a point about liberty or law, he slaps her on the thigh.
Hard.
Yeah, hard.
To the point where she apparently complained she was black and blue and had to put a table between them, just for, like, self-preservation.
Exactly, and that specific image, this frantic, unbelievably enthusiastic philosopher just physically assaulting an autocrat with his ideas, that, to me, is Denis Diderot in a nutshell.
It really is, because we tend to file this guy away, in history class as the Encyclopédie guy.
Right. The dusty librarian who put all of human knowledge in alphabetical order.
Which is, it's technically true, but it's sort of like calling the Beatles a garage band from Liverpool. It just completely misses the sheer chaotic scale of what he was actually doing.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today.
Yeah,
because when you actually get into the sources, the letters, the secret manuscripts he hid, the actual police reports on him, you realize Diderot wasn't just compiling a dictionary.
No.
He was building a bomb.
A slow-motion bomb, maybe, but
Yeah.
definitely one that you could argue did more to dismantle the old regime than, any single riot ever did.
So for this deep dive, we're really going to look at two different versions of this man. First, there's the public Diderot. That's the editor, the hustler, the guy who's trying to change the way people think without getting himself executed.
And then there's the other one, the secret Diderot.
This is the part that I find fascinating.
Me too. This is the guy who's writing absolute masterpieces. Books that predict evolution, that deconstruct how novels even work, that analyze human corruption with this brutal honesty. And then what does he do? He shoves them in a drawer.
Literally hides them away.
Yes. He knew the world wasn't ready for them. He knew the censors would burn him, or worse. So he skipped his own century. He decided he was writing for us.
Which is just a hell of a gamble, isn't it? To bet your entire legacy on an audience that won't even be born for another, 200 years?
It's an incredible act of faith in the future.
So to really understand how a cutler's son from Champagne ends up making that kind of bet, we have to start at the beginning. He wasn't born into the Parisian elite or anything like that, was he?
Oh, far from it. He was born in 1713 in Langres, in the Champagne region, and his background is actually super important for understanding his later philosophy. He wasn't aristocracy. He wasn't part of the academic establishment. His father, Didier Diderot, was a master cutler.
A knife maker.
Exactly. A highly skilled craftsman. He made surgical instruments, lances, all sorts of fine knives. And this gave Diderot a lifelong respect for trade, for tools, for the physical reality of how things are actually made.
So he had this real-world, hands-on perspective from the very beginning.
He did, in an era where a lot of philosophers sort of looked down on manual labor as something, servile or base. Diderot had this almost blue-collar appreciation for the mechanical arts. He understood that the world is made of matter, and you can shape that matter with skill and with your hands.
It feels like that tangible connection to the physical world really grounded him. He wasn't just thinking in abstract forms. He was thinking about, steel and edges and function.
Yeah.
But the family dynamic itself, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing.
Not at all. It's a classic rebellion story, really. His father wanted him to become a respectable professional. He had a sister, Denise, who Diderot absolutely adored. He called her female Socrates, which I love.
Wow.
But the family had very specific plans for Denis. They wanted him to be a priest, maybe a lawyer.
The safe, steady path, the respectable career.
Right. And he went along with it for a while. He studied with the Jesuits. He actually did consider the clergy. And then he pivoted to law school for a bit. But in 1734, he makes the decision that, terrifies parents in any century.
What's that?
He decides he's just going to be a writer in Paris with no money.
And his father, the master knife maker who values practical, tangible things, I'm guessing he didn't love the idea of his son becoming a scribbler.
He disowned him. Just cut him off completely. No more money, no more support. You're on your own.
There he is. We have a 20-something Diderot, totally disowned, and he's loose in Paris in the 1740s.
Yeah.
It really strikes me that he's essentially living the gig economy life, just 300 years early. He's translating, he's hustling for any work he can find.
It is absolutely the starving artist phase. The sources call it his bohemian existence. He's living in a garret, a tiny attic room wearing old, worn-out clothes. He's doing any translation work he can get just to pay for food. He's translating a history of Greece, a medicinal dictionary, just pure grunt work. But this is also where he starts building his network, finding his people.
And he meets Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
He does. Another future heavy hitter of the Enlightenment.
How did they meet?
They meet at the Café de la Régence, which was the spot for chess and coffee in Paris. You can just picture it, right? Two broke, brilliant young guys watching these intense chess games, drinking coffee they can barely afford, and just complaining about the state of the world.
The start of a beautiful and very tumultuous friendship.
They were thick as thieves back then, and it's in the middle of all this poverty and intellectual ferment that Diderot, of course, falls in love.
With Antoinette Champion.
Right. And on paper, from his family's perspective, this was a complete disaster. She was a very devout Catholic, which he was already moving away from. She had no money, no dowry, and very low social standing. She was a linen draper's daughter.
So not exactly a strategic match for moving up in the world.
Not at all. And his father absolutely hated it. He hated the match so much, he actually tried to get Diderot imprisoned to prevent the marriage from happening.
He tried to have his own son locked up.
Yes. But Diderot, being Diderot stubborn and rebellious, he just went and married her anyway, in secret, in 1743.
I feel like there's a but coming. The romantic rebel marries for love against his father's wishes. Usually that story either ends with, and they lived happily ever after, or it goes completely off a cliff.
Yeah, it went off a cliff pretty quickly. The marriage was not a happy one. The sources paint Antoinette as pious and, well, maybe a bit of a nag, but you also have to admit Diderot was probably impossible to live with. He was restless, he was always working, always out, and he wasn't faithful. He had a whole series of affairs, but the most significant one, the one that really mattered intellectually and emotionally, was with a woman named Sophie Volland.
And we know so much about this because of the letters, right? I've seen them described as literature in their own right.
Yes. His correspondence with Sophie Volland is it's incredible. Historians consider it one of the absolute literary treasures of the 18th century. They're not just love letters. They are a direct feed from his brain to the page.
A window into his mind.
The completely unfiltered window. He writes to her about philosophy, about court gossip, about new scientific discoveries, about his digestion, about the plays he saw last night. It's the most candid, honest look we have into his mind. He didn't have to filter himself with her the way he did for the public.
So, okay, he's broke, he's unhappily married, he's pouring his soul out in letters to his mistress, he needs cash. And this leads to one of the absolute weirdest origin stories for a philosophical work I have ever heard. We have to talk about the talking jewelry.
Ah, yes. Les bijoux indiscrets, or the indiscreet jewels, published in 1748.
Tell us the story behind this because it's wild.
It is. So the story goes that his mistress at the time, a woman named Madeleine de Prizieux, this is before Sophie Volland, was demanding money. He was broke. At some point, Diderot made a comment that writing a novel was trivial, that it was easy. She basically dared him to do it.
So he writes a novel on a dare.
On a dare, and to make some quick money. He supposedly churned it out in about 2 weeks. And the result is, well, it's basically erotica.
But it's Diderot, so it has to have a twist. It can't just be smut.
It has a very, very strange twist. The plot involves a sultan who gets a magic ring from a genie. When he points this ring at any woman, the book uses the slang term bijou or jewels, but it's a euphemism for her vagina.
Okay.
Her jewels begin to speak.
It talks.
It talks. And it confesses all of its sexual experiences out loud for everyone to hear.
I mean, that's certainly a premise. It sounds like something from a bad B movie.
It absolutely is. And on the surface, it's just bawdy and scandalous. But because Diderot can't help himself, he just stuffs the book with these long digressions on philosophy, music theory, and literature. It's actually a pretty sharp satire of the French court and the gossip culture of Versailles. But there's one specific chapter that really hints at where his mind is going.
The dream sequence.
Yes. There's this bizarre dream sequence where a child named Experiment grows into a giant and systematically destroys a huge ancient temple named Hypothesis.
That's actually really profound. It's the scientific method literally destroying old dogma and received wisdom, and he's hidden it inside this dirty joke about a magic ring.
Exactly. It shows that even when he was, slumming it for cash, his mind was already attacking the established order. He was making this argument that we can't just guess how the world works based on old books or theories. That's hypothesis. We have to go out and test it. We have to experiment.
And did it work? Did he make his money?
Oh, yeah. The book was sold clandestinely, of course, but it was a massive hit. It actually ended up being the most published and widely read work of his entire career during his own lifetime. He later called it a debauchery of the mind, but it paid the bills.
So he pays the bills with talking jewels, but he's clearly gearing up for something much more serious. We start to see a shift in the late 1740s. He starts writing things that are genuinely politically dangerous.
This is where we meet the dangerous philosopher. In 1746, he publishes his first really original work, Philosophical Thoughts. Now, he's still a deist at this point. He believes in a god, but a distant one, like a watchmaker who wound up the universe and then just walked away.
But he's already pushing boundaries.
He is. He's arguing for the importance of feeling and passion alongside pure reason, which was a bit radical. And he's already leveling some pretty sharp critiques at institutional Christianity.
And the police are starting to pay attention to this guy.
They definitely are. A year later, in 1747, he writes another piece called The Skeptic's Walk. It's a dialogue between a deist, an atheist, and a pantheist. The police actually seized the manuscript before it could even be published. They were onto him.
But the real turning point, the thing that really lands him in hot water, is the Letter on the Blind in 1749.
Yes. Lettre sur les aveugles. This is the pivot point. This is where he stops being just a literary nuisance and starts being a genuine threat to the state.
The title sounds so clinical, though. It sounds like a medical case study you'd find in a dusty archive somewhere.
And that was the whole trick. The Enlightenment was obsessed with this thought experiment posed by a scientist named Molina. The question was, if a man born blind who knows shapes only by touching them, a cube, a sphere, suddenly gains his sight, would he be able to tell the difference between the cube and the sphere just by looking at them?
So it's a question about hardware versus software, almost. Is our brain preloaded with an understanding of geometry, or do we have to learn it all through our eyes?
Precisely. The empiricists, like John Locke, said, no. We are blank slates. We learn everything through our senses. Diderot takes this idea and just sprints with it. He interviews a real blind man to understand how he structures his world, but then he introduces a character based on a real person, Nicholas Saunderson, a brilliant, blind English mathematician.
And this is where the trouble starts.
This is it, because in the book, Saunderson is on his deathbed. A priest is there, trying to get him to repent, to accept God, and the priest uses the classic argument.
Let me guess. Look at the beauty of the world. Look at the stars. Look at the complexity of the human eye. Surely only a divine designer could have made all this.
That's it, exactly. It's the argument from design, the watchmaker analogy. The world is so complex and ordered, someone must have built it.
And Saunderson, the blind man, just destroys it.
Completely. He says to the priest, if you want me to believe in God, you have to let me touch him. He says, you look at the world around you and see perfection and order. I touch my own body. I feel my own blindness and I see a mistake. I see a world that is not perfect.
Wow. That is chilling. He's basically arguing that the existence of God is relative to your senses. If you can't see the glory of creation, does that glory even exist for you?
And it gets even worse for the priest. Saunderson then goes on to argue that if there is a God, he's a distinct underachiever. And he introduces this concept that is just, it's shockingly Darwinian.
A century before Darwin.
Well, century before Darwin. He imagines the universe not as a perfect static clock, but as this chaotic soup of matter constantly mixing and matching over millions and millions of years.
A relentless churning of atoms.
Right. And he says that in this process, monsters are created constantly. Creatures with no heads or 3 legs or no stomachs. They can't survive, so they die immediately. We never see them. The only things that we do see are the ones that, by sheer chance, worked.
So what we call design is just survivorship bias. It's just the stuff that didn't immediately fall apart.
Exactly. In 1749, he is describing, in principle, the theory of natural selection. He is stripping the divine magic out of the act of creation and replacing it with trial, error, and deep time. The historian Conway Zirkle noted that this passage is so accurate, it almost forces you to accept evolution even without all the evidence we have today.
So talking vaginas was one thing. The authorities could sort of ignore that as smut, but denying the divine order of the entire universe, that's another level.
That they could not let slide. In July of 1749, the police come for him. They had been watching him. They raid his house. He's arrested, and he's thrown into the dungeon at the Chateau de Vincennes.
Solitary confinement.
Complete solitary confinement.
And this is where we get that incredible MacGyver moment.
It really is. He has no paper, no pen, no ink, but Diderot cannot not write. His mind is just racing constantly. The only book they let him keep was a copy of Milton's Paradise Lost. So he scraped the slate from the dungeon walls, crushed it into a fine dust, mixed it with some wine they gave him with his meals to make a kind of ink.
And used a toothpick as a pen.
And used a sharpened toothpick as a pen to write notes in the margins of Paradise Lost.
Writing notes with wine slate ink. I mean, that is just incredible dedication, but it also speaks to a kind of desperation, doesn't it?
It does. He was terrified. He had no idea if or when he would ever get out. He was completely cut off from his friends, his family, his work. Eventually, after about 3 months, he cracked. He signed a humiliating letter of submission, promising not to write any more debaucheries of that kind.
And they let him go.
They let him go. But he was released for a very specific reason. Not out of mercy, but because a group of powerful publishers desperately needed him for a massive new project.
The Encyclopédie.
The project that would consume the next 20 years of his life.
Right, so he gets out of Vincennes, but he's on a very short leash. He knows he's being watched. He needs a project that's big enough to pay the bills, but theoretically, at least safe enough to keep him out of the dungeon. Enter the Encyclopédie.
The project that basically ate his life. And we really need to frame the scale of this thing. This wasn't just a book. This was a 20-year war of attrition. By the time it was finished, it was 28 volumes, 71,818 articles, over 3,000 distinct custom-made illustrations.
And it didn't start that way, did it? Initially, it was just supposed to be a straightforward translation of an English dictionary, right? A quick cash grab for the publishers.
That was the original plan, yes. Just translate Ephraim Chambers' Cyclopedia. But Diderot, being Diderot, he couldn't just translate. He saw a bigger opportunity. He realized that knowledge in 18th century France was completely gatekept.
What do you mean by that?
Well, if you wanted to know about theology, you had to ask a priest. If you wanted to know about law, you had to consult a nobleman. If you wanted to know how to make glass or weave silk, well, you actually couldn't find out. Those were trade secrets guarded by the guilds.
So knowledge was siloed. It was kept separate and controlled by different groups.
Exactly. And Diderot wanted to smash the silos. His grand vision was to consolidate all human knowledge, not just academic knowledge, but the practical knowledge of trades and crafts, the mechanical arts, and make it accessible to everyone.
This goes right back to his dad, the knife maker.
It absolutely does. Diderot held this really radical belief that the man who weaves the silk for the bishop's robe is just as intellectually valuable as the bishop who wears it. So he and his team went into the workshops. He didn't just read a book about weaving. He went to the factories. He spent days learning how to strip a quill, how to cast a cannon, how to properly tan leather.
There's a story in the notes that he would actually have craftsmen bring their machines to his office, disassemble them piece by piece, and then reassemble them in front of him so he could commission accurate illustrations.
The plates. The illustrations are the secret weapon of the Encyclopédie. Before this, if you looked at a diagram of a machine, it was usually kind of artistic and not very clear. Diderot pioneered the use of exploded views, literally showing the screw, the lever, the gear, all separated and floating in space. It was an instruction manual for civilization itself.
Okay, that all sounds great. It sounds progressive and useful. But why was it so dangerous? Why would the Pope ban a book about how to tan leather?
Because of the cross-references. This is where Diderot was an absolute genius of subversion. He knew the royal censors were reading the big, obvious articles, Christ, king, soul. So in those articles, he kept the definitions relatively orthodox.
He played nice in the headlines.
Exactly. But then at the end of the article, he'd add a little distinct symbol, a renvoi, a cross-reference.
Like a hyperlink in a modern web page.
Precisely. It was a paper hyperlink. So, for instance, you're reading the article on cannibalism. It describes, people eating human flesh, gross, barbaric, something only savages do. But then at the bottom of the article, there's a little link. See also, Eucharist.
Oh, wow. No, he didn't. He linked the Catholic ritual of consuming the body and blood of Christ directly to cannibalism.
Very subtly, yes. He never says it out loud. He just puts the link there and lets you connect the dots yourself. Or you'd read an article on the Cordeliers, a specific order of Franciscan monks, and the cross-reference at the bottom would guide you to the entry for capuchon, which is a monk's hood, but it's also a plant known for putting people to sleep.
The shade. He's calling the monks boring and useless.
He's calling them a useless narcotic. The whole encyclopedia was a treasure hunt like this. If you followed the links, you found the real radical philosophy hidden beneath the surface. He was teaching an entire generation of readers how to think critically, not just telling them what to know.
It's the ultimate Trojan horse. You buy it for the diagrams of windmills and plows, But you end up becoming an atheist who questions the monarchy.
And the government absolutely knew it. They revoked the project's printing license in 1759. They threatened the printers with being sent to the galleys, which was basically being chained to an oar on a ship until you die. The Pope officially put it on the index of forbidden books and threatened to excommunicate any Catholic who read it. The pressure was immense.
And his co-editor, D'Alembert, he quits.
D'Alembert quit. He was a brilliant mathematician, but he was also cautious. He saw the writing on the wall and said, "I'm done. This is suicide. I'm out."
But Diderot stayed.
Diderot stayed for 10 more years, alone. He personally wrote nearly 7,000 of the articles himself. He ruined his eyesight proofreading pages by candlelight. He basically became a ghost, working in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder, never knowing when the police might knock on his door again.
It becomes a spy story at this point, doesn't it? There was a mole inside the government helping him.
Yes, and this is one of the most amazing parts of the story. His secret protector was a man named Malesherbes, who was the official government director of the book trade. He was the chief censor, the guy who literally signed the orders to raid Diderot's house and confiscate his papers, was secretly a pro-Enlightenment official.
So the chief censor was on their side.
He was. There's this incredible moment where Malesherbes has to, for political reasons, order a raid on Diderot's house to confiscate the Encyclopédie manuscripts. He sends a secret message to Diderot the day before, saying, "They're coming for you tomorrow." Diderot panics and says, "But I have thousands of pages. I have nowhere to hide them."
Yeah, and what does Malesherbes say?
Malesherbes says, "Send them all to my house. Nobody will ever think to look for them there."
That is just incredible. The banned books were being hidden in the home of a government official responsible for banning them. It really shows you how pervasive these Enlightenment ideas were becoming. Even the people running the system knew this system was broken.
But the personal cost for Diderot was immense. And there's a final tragic irony to this 20-year struggle. He's sacrificing his freedom, his health, his personal safety, all to publish this monument to human knowledge and truth. And then, the great betrayal.
Le Breton, his publisher, the man who was getting rich off of Diderot's incredible risk. Walk us through what Le Breton did, because this is the kind of corporate sabotage that would make a modern CEO just blush.
It was 1764. The project is almost done. The final volumes are at the printer. Diderot thinks he's finally crossed the finish line after 2 decades of hell. He goes to consult a printed volume for a cross-reference and realizes the text. It doesn't look right. It feels shorter than he remembered. He checks another article. It's wrong, too.
What has happened?
He discovers that his publisher, Le Breton, was so terrified of being arrested that after Diderot finished his meticulous editing and went home for the night, Le Breton and his foreman were going into the print shop, taking the typesetting, and physically cutting out entire paragraphs and sentences they thought were too dangerous.
They were censoring the encyclopedia after the editor-in-chief had signed off on the proofs.
Yes, and the worst part, they burned Diderot's original corrected manuscripts to cover their tracks. So Diderot didn't just lose the printed text, he lost the only record of what he had actually written. He discovered that the work he had spent 25 years of his life on had been, in his words, mutilated and defaced.
Oh, I can't even imagine. You spend 2 decades building this monument to truth, and your own boss secretly defaces it right before the unveiling.
Diderot was devastated. He wept. He confronted Le Breton and said, "You have massacred the work of 20 good men and wasted 25 years of my life." He felt that his great contribution to the world, his legacy, had been ruined.
But looking back now, from our perspective, was it a waste?
Absolutely not. Even in its mutilated form, the Encyclopédie was a revolutionary document. It completely changed the intellectual landscape of Europe. It democratized knowledge. It absolutely laid the intellectual groundwork for the French Revolution. But for Diderot personally, it was the final straw. He realized that if he wanted to write the pure truth, the unmutilated truth, he couldn't publish it. Not in France, not in the 18th century.
And that's what drives him underground. That's what gives us the secret Diderot.
Yeah.
Because while all of this encyclopedia nightmare was going on, he was writing these other, even more radical books and just putting them away in a drawer.
Writing for the drawer. It's a fascinating psychological state to be in. In a way, he was freed from censorship because he wasn't even trying to please a censor anymore. He was writing for an ideal reader, a future audience that didn't exist yet.
Let's talk about some of these secret masterpieces. Let's start with The Nun, La Religieuse, because the origin of this story is, again, kind of a practical joke, right?
Diderot loved a good prank. So he had a friend, the Marquis de Cramail, who had moved away from Paris to the countryside. Diderot and his circle of friends missed him and wanted him to come back, so they hatched this plan. They started writing these fake letters to the Marquis, pretending to be a young nun named Suzanne who is begging for his help to escape her convent.
They were catfishing the Marquis.
Essentially, yes. They were inventing this tragic, damsel in distress figure to lure their friend back to the city. But Diderot got so invested in the character of Suzanne and her voice and her suffering that he ended up turning the whole elaborate prank into a full-blown novel. His friends would find him at his desk weeping over his own writing, and he'd say, "I can't help it. Poor Suzanne is suffering so much."
And The Nun is not a lighthearted romp. It's not The Sound of Music.
No, it is a gothic horror story. Suzanne is an illegitimate child who is forced into a convent by her parents to hide their sin and avoid paying a dowry. But she doesn't have a religious vocation. She just wants to be free. And the book details, in excruciating detail, the psychological and physical abuse she suffers. The other nuns, the mother superiors, some are just cruel and sadistic, others are sexually predatory.
So he depicts the convent not as a sanctuary of faith, but as a kind of prison that drives people mad.
Exactly. His main point wasn't necessarily to attack Christianity itself, but to attack the institution of forced cloistering. He believed that if you lock people up and deny their basic human nature, their need for freedom, for sex, for society, for intellectual stimulation, that nature will warp. It will become toxic and monstrous. He was using fiction to make a very powerful psychological argument about fundamental human needs.
And he never even tried to publish this in his lifetime.
Absolutely not. It finally came out in 1796, well after he and the French monarchy were both dead. If he had published that in the 1760s, he would have been back in the dungeon at Vincennes, and they probably would have thrown away the key.
Then there's Rameau's nephew. This is considered by many, especially later philosophers, to be his true masterpiece. What is going on in this book? It sounds very strange.
It is strange. It's the dialogue, which was Diderot's favorite format because it allowed him to argue with himself and explore all sides of an issue. It's a long, rambling conversation between two characters. Moi, which means me, who is a stand-in for Diderot the philosopher, and Louis, which means him. And him is the dissolute ne'er-do-well nephew of the famous composer Jean-Philippe Rameau.
I think that nephew is quite a character.
He is one of the great characters in literature. He's a failed musician, a moocher, a parasite, a brilliant cynic. He is completely amoral. He believes that the world is a brutal jungle where everyone is eating everyone else, so you might as well grab whatever pleasure you can. He has this great line, "Hurrah for wisdom, to drink good wines, gorge on choice foods, tumble pretty women. Outside of that, all is vanity."
He sounds like a modern anti-hero. The Joker to Diderot's Batman? Or maybe a character out of a Dostoevsky novel.
That's a great analogy. The philosopher character, Moi, tries to argue for virtue, for morality, for the greater good, and the nephew just tears every single argument to shreds. He exposes the hypocrisy of so-called polite society. He points out that the virtuous people are often boring or secretly corrupt, while the scoundrels are at least honest about their appetites and are having all the fun.
So why is this book so important philosophically?
Because Diderot doesn't let the good guy win. The dialogue ends in a stalemate. The nephew makes genuinely compelling points about how society forces people to debase themselves just to survive. The German philosopher Hegel, years later, fell in love with this book. He saw it as a brilliant anticipation of his master-slave dialectic. It's a critique of the Enlightenment from inside the Enlightenment. It admits that reason alone might not be enough to make people happy or truly good.
And the journey of this manuscript is just as wild as the content, right?
It's like a literary thriller. It was found among his papers after his death. A copy was smuggled to Russia, then to Germany. It was given to the poet Schiller, who then gave it to Goethe, the author of Faust. Goethe was so blown away, he translated it into German himself and published it in 1805. For a long time, the French only knew about this French masterpiece by translating it back from Goethe's German.
That is completely absurd. The French had to read one of their own greatest philosophers via a German translation because he had hidden his work so well.
It just shows you how effectively Diderot had sealed his best work away from his own time.
We also have to touch on Jacques the Fatalist. This sounds like another metafictional mind-bender.
It is. It's a novel about a servant, Jacques, and his unnamed master who are traveling somewhere. We never find out where. And Jacques is a fatalist. He believes that everything that happens, good or bad, is written on a great scroll in the sky. So the book is a long exploration of free will versus determinism, but it's the style that's so revolutionary. Diderot constantly breaks the fourth wall.
So, like Deadpool or Fleabag does today.
Exactly like that, but 200 years earlier. The narrator directly argues with the reader. He'll stop the story and say things like, "You want me to tell you where they're going? Why should I? This is my story. I can send them wherever I want." He interrupts the plot to tell you that all stories are fake and that he is in control.
It sounds like something written in the 1960s or 70s, like Tristram Shandy or a Kurt Vonnegut novel.
It was unbelievably avant-garde. He was deconstructing the conventions of the novel before the novel was even fully established as a form. He was playing with the whole idea of narrative, asking, who is really in control here? The author, the characters, the reader, or is it all just fate written on that great scroll?
So we have the rebel, the encyclopedia editor, the secret writer, but we can't ignore Diderot the art critic.
Yeah.
You mentioned in the intro that he basically invented the genre.
Yeah.
How do you invent art criticism?
Well, before Diderot, people wrote about art, but it was usually very academic or technical. It was all about composition and color theory and classical illusions. Diderot wrote for a private, handwritten newsletter called the Correspondance Littéraire, which was circulated to a few dozen VIP subscribers across Europe, princes, kings, Catherine the Great. The crucial thing is, most of his readers would never actually see the paintings he was writing about at the Paris salons.
So he had to paint a picture with words.
Yeah.
He had to make them see it.
Exactly. He had to translate the visual experience into a verbal one. And he did it with this incredible, emotional, vivid language that one of his friends said was almost a new sense. He wouldn't just describe the painting, he would walk into it. He'd start talking to the figures in the scene. He'd criticize the painter for bad lighting or stick postures as if he were a theater director giving notes to an actor.
So he wasn't just describing what was on the canvas. He was describing the feeling it produced in him.
And he was so opinionated. He loved the painter Jean-Baptiste Greuze, who did these sentimental, moralizing scenes of family life. And he absolutely hated François Boucher, who painted these fluffy pink rococo nudes and flying cupids. He thought Boucher's work was frivolous. Diderot believed art had to have a moral purpose. It had to move you. He famously wrote, "First, touch me, astonish me, tear me apart, make me weep, shudder, feel outrage."
And then, if you can, delight my eyes.
Exactly. For him, the emotional impact came first. The aesthetics were secondary. He wanted art to be a profound experience, not just pretty wallpaper for aristocrats.
And speaking of profound experiences, he also gave us a very famous phrase from his theater writings, l'esprit de l'escalier,
Staircase vie.
which is that universal feeling of thinking of the perfect witty comeback only after you've left the party and you're already walking down the stairs.
We have all been there. And Diderot, who was by all accounts a brilliant and energetic conversationalist, felt that acutely. He wrote that he was very sensitive, and when he was in a heated argument or felt overwhelmed, his mind would just go blank. It was only later in the quiet that the perfect zinger would strike him. It really humanizes him. Even the smartest man in France sometimes couldn't think of a good retort until he was in the cab on the way home.
Now, for all this genius, Diderot was perpetually broke. He had a daughter, Angelique, that he adored, and he needed to provide a dowry for her. He had no pension, no savings. And who steps in to save the day? None other than his fan, Catherine the Great of Russia.
It's one of history's oddest and most interesting friendships. In 1765, Catherine hears that Diderot was being forced to sell his massive library to pay for his daughter's dowry. She wants to cultivate this image of herself as an enlightened monarch, so she makes this grand gesture. She says, "I will buy your library," and she pays him a huge sum for it. But then she adds a condition.
What's the condition?
She says, "You will keep the books in Paris. You are now my librarian, employed by me, and here is a generous salary to take care of them." She even paid him 50 years' salary up front.
So she buys his library but leaves it at his house and pays him to be its caretaker. That is a brilliant power move.
It was the ultimate form of patronage. It gave him financial security for the rest of his life. And eventually, Diderot felt a deep obligation to go and thank her in person. So in 1773, at the age of 60, he undertakes this incredibly arduous journey to St. Petersburg.
The 60-year-old philosopher who hated traveling, dragging himself across a frozen Europe in a horse-drawn carriage.
He was miserable on the journey. He got colic. He hated the food. But he finally arrives, and he and Catherine just hit it off. They met almost daily for months. And this brings us right back to the thigh slapping. He spoke to her, in his words, man to man. He completely forgot she was an all-powerful autocrat. He treated her like one of the guys back at the Café de la Régence in Paris.
And he tried to give her serious political advice, right? He tried to turn Russia into a constitutional monarchy.
He did. He spent his time there drafting these vast, elaborate plans for reforming the entire Russian state. He told her she should abdicate her absolute power. He told her to establish a legal code where the nation is sovereign, not the monarch. He basically told the Empress of Russia, you should fire yourself for the good of the people.
I can't imagine an empress taking that particularly well.
Yeah. She was very polite to his face. She enjoyed his intellect and his energy. But later, she dismissed his plans as incoherent gibberish. And she wrote this famous, devastating letter about him. She said, Monsieur Diderot, in your plans for reform, you forget the difference between our two positions. You work only on paper, which accepts anything. It is smooth and flexible and offers no resistance to your imagination or your pen. But I, a poor empress, I work on human skin, which is altogether more irritable and ticklish.
Wow. You write on paper, I write on skin. That is such a crushing critique of the gap between theory and practice.
It is. It's the ultimate collision of the idealist philosopher and the realist politician. Diderot was dreaming of a perfect, rational society. Catherine was trying to manage a massive, feudal, unruly empire without getting overthrown or assassinated. But they did remain on good terms, and when he died, his library did eventually make its way to Russia.
Let's talk about the end of his life and the final evolution of his philosophy. We mentioned the letter on the blind hinted at evolution, but as he got older, his private writings got even wilder. D'Alembert's Dream.
This is maybe his most radical scientific and philosophical work, written in 1769, and of course written only for the drawer. It's another dialogue where the philosopher D'Alembert is dreaming, and Diderot, or a character representing him, interprets the strange, feverish things he says in his sleep. In it, he explores a pure, uncompromising materialism.
What does that mean in this context? Because today, materialism just means, buying expensive cars and watches.
In philosophy, materialism is the belief that nothing exists except matter and its movements. There is no soul, no spirit that is separate from the physical body. Everything, life, consciousness, emotion, thought, it's all just the product of atoms arranging and rearranging themselves. It's all just vibrating strings or fermenting molecules.
So when we die,
we just disassemble. The collection of molecules that is you just comes apart and gets recycled back into the universe. He writes, everything changes, everything passes, nothing remains but the whole. He sees the universe as this one giant interconnected system, a perpetual recycling plant. The atoms that are you today might be grass tomorrow, or a worm, or part of a distant star. It's a very modern, scientific, ecological view of the universe. No gods, no souls, just matter in motion.
Yeah, because he didn't believe in a soul or an afterlife, he had to grapple with a huge question. If there's no heaven or hell, what's the point? Why be good? Why bother writing books that no one will read until you're long dead?
And this is where his beautiful, poignant concept of posterity comes in. This is really the emotional core of his atheism.
How so?
He famously wrote, posterity is for the philosopher what the other world is for the man of religion. He believed that since there was no divine judgment, the only judgment that mattered was that of future generations, of us. He believed that if he wrote the truth honestly and fearlessly, then one day we would find his work and vindicate him. That was his heaven, being read and understood by you right now, in this moment.
That actually gives me chills. He was projecting all of his hope, his entire legacy 250 years into the future. He was counting on us to get it.
He died in 1784, just 5 years before the French Revolution he helped to inspire. He died while eating an apricot compote, actually. His wife tried to stop him, saying it would make him sick. His last words were reportedly, "What the devil harm do you think that will do to me now?" He ate it, leaned back in his chair, and died of a pulmonary thrombosis.
A final act of defiance against bodily decay right up until the very last second.
But his afterlife, his physical afterlife, was messy. He was buried in the Church of Saint-Roch in Paris. But during the most radical phase of the Revolution, in 1793, the mood changed. The revolutionary government needed lead to make bullets to fight the monarchies of Europe, so grave robbers raided the church. They stripped the lead from the coffins, and they just dumped the bodies. Diderot's remains were most likely thrown into a common, unmarked mass grave, lost forever.
That is just a tragic, terrible irony. The man who laid so much of the intellectual groundwork for the revolution gets his grave desecrated and his body tossed in a pit by the revolutionaries themselves.
It is, and for a while the revolutionaries actually turned on him. Robespierre, with his cult of the supreme being, didn't like Diderot's atheism. Some even blamed Diderot's anti-clerical writings for persecuting the clergy. It took a very long time for his reputation to recover and for those secret books to finally come to light. Romo's nephew didn't even appear in French until 1821. The Nun was in 1796. The full, unexpurgated collection of his works didn't really come out until the mid-20th century.
So, as we wrap this deep dive up, how do we synthesize this man, Denis Diderot? He's the encyclopedia guy, but he's also the pornographer, the prisoner, the art critic, the proto-evolutionist, the secret novelist.
I think Diderot is the ultimate figure of the Enlightenment precisely because he is so human. Voltaire can be witty, but also feel a bit cold and superior. Rousseau is incredibly passionate, but was also arguably paranoid and narcissistic. Diderot's just messy. He's contradictory. He wants to be a virtuous man, but he's unfaithful to his wife. He loves the truth, but he pulls elaborate pranks on his friends. He is certified genius, but he's also deeply insecure and feels staircase wit.
He feels like a person you could actually have a beer with. Or, a coffee at the Café de la Régence.
Absolutely. He was this incredible combination of forces. He democratized knowledge for the public with the Encyclopédie, but he reserved his deepest, most challenging, most dangerous truth for the future. He trusted us to be able to handle what his own century couldn't. He made a bet that one day we would be free enough to really hear what he had to say.
And that really brings us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Diderot placed all his chips on this idea of posterity. He bet his entire legacy on the idea that future humans, that's us, would be enlightened enough to understand him, to appreciate his radical questioning of all authority, all religion, and all social norms.
When he was sitting across from Catherine the Great, slapping her knee, he was trying to bridge that huge gap between the philosophical ideal and the political real. He failed with her, but he left all the blueprints, all the secret writings, for us.
So the question is this. Are we the audience he was expecting? In a world of misinformation and social media bubbles and political polarization, have we actually lived up to the trust he placed in posterity? Or would he look at our world today and just start slapping our knees in frustration?
That is the question.
Something to think about. That's it for this deep dive into the chaotic and brilliant mind of Denis Diderot. Thanks for listening.